everybody. Are we all here?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome. Today we're going to hear about how 3 medical product companies made their path to Agile while remaining compliant with all the regulatory concerns. I'm Nancy Schooenderwoert, and next I'll just do a little brief intro for myself.
Hold up.
Even closer.
Mic closer? Okay, how's that? All right, my mic is closer. Okay, I began doing electrical design and software design for flight simulators when I first graduated from college. My degree was sort of a combination of double E and computer science. I worked for a number of years in flight simulation. Our company had all the big contracts for the airlines, the Defense Department, NASA. So we got to work on a variety of systems and doing the hardware plus the software and just being involved in the whole simulation environment was really helpful later on when I started, using Agile practices, or I should say developing some of them. I later went on to work for GE for a time, working on sonar systems and various other, communication systems for defense. And beyond that, I also worked on factory automation, really all sorts of embedded systems applications. I also worked on a couple of medical devices for Welsh Allen time. And during that project, we were building a vision screening device, and it let people, eye doctors measure for glaucoma symptoms. Anyway, the interesting thing about that project that I was on for the medical device, that was the first time I ever saw a project come in on time for the original schedule. And a lot of the reason for that is myself and my colleagues, we were experimenting with test-first practices for both the hardware and the software. And of course, those practices have evolved greatly since. All right, before I move on, I just want to make a nod for my co-author, Brian Shoemaker, who's pictured here. He and I both developed all the information that you see tonight. Okay, these are the case studies we're going to look at. They come from a company called Impeco, and I titled it Efficiency for Survival. We'll also look at one from Sanofi, which has to do with long-range planning, and another one from a company called Bluefruit, which is about agility at all levels of the company throughout. And before I go on much further, though, I have a question for you all here. I just want to know, how about a show of hands, how many people here have been involved in your company's move to Agile practices or development of those practices? Okay, a good number of hands are going up. Suppose, let me ask another question. Have you ever heard of tick box Agile?
Sorry, what?
Tick box Agile. No? I see some nods. Well, that's where you're just going through the motions and there's not real change happening, right? I think everybody's heard of that. Or maybe by another name. Some people call it terms and ceremonies only. Again, not real change. If you had a friend who was working in another company and they were telling you about how their company is adopting Agile practices, and let's say you talked to this friend over a period of time, do you think you'd be able to tell if that company was using tick box Agile or something better?
Yeah.
Yeah? I'm seeing a few heads nodding here. Okay, well, that's kind of how the situation was for myself and Brian. For some of the case studies that we included in our book, they were from people that we knew from the industry over a period of time. They were telling us about their adventures. Some of the case studies came from past clients of ourselves. And, in any case, I think this is case studies are a really great way to learn. And we've got another person here who agrees with us on that, so I'm going to say that's good to go. Before I get further along, I want to mention a couple of things before I start into the case studies. There's been a perception or persistent belief for a long time that Agile is either just not appropriate for this kind of work, or that it's disorganized or not even allowed. That just couldn't be further from the truth. And there's also, to the extent that some medical device companies have tried Agile, they tend to go with this tick box mentality, which they sort of get from maybe the way they do other things too. But these are just things that I see changing now, and I'm glad of that. So there's less of that belief that Agile is not workable. Okay, moving along. Another thing I want to mention, Agile is not prohibited in any way, shape, or form. It's true that you have to work to predetermined requirements, but you can predetermine them at any time. The regulations don't constrain you. It's important to know that. You just can't be doing it after the fact, because the regulations are there for a good reason. They don't want people to just do any old thing and then claim they were thoughtful about it. Okay. There's another factoid that's going to matter when we come to some of the case studies, and this is the concept of a QMS, a quality management system. You have to do your work under the control of a valid QMS, and there's a regulatory document that defines what a valid QMS is, and you can be audited based on that. Okay, that's one of the certifications that companies get. The reason I'm mentioning it is if you go ahead and develop your software anyway, and you haven't got a validated QMS in place, you'll never get it certified. In fact, you might have to just throw that software away and write it over again. That's going to come up in one of our case studies. A little sneak preview there. I want to give a brief mention to this document called TIR 45. At the end of the presentation, I'll give you a link to that. That document is, it was put together by regulatory people, industry people, and Agile coaches who know what they're doing. It's not written in legalese. It's well written and it's readable. It's a document you have to purchase from the agency that developed it, but it's an advisory document, it's not a regulation. But anyway, I just want to say it's well written, and if you do work in the medical device industry, it's well worth getting a copy. And for the case studies that I'm going to go into today, you don't have to be a regulatory expert. What I just said is all the background you really need to follow them. Okay, so let's start in with one. Okay, Inteco. This is a company that is got a foot in two countries, Switzerland and Italy. They have production facilities just outside of Milan. And let's see, what I want to say about them overall. They're a dominant player in the field of automation for clinical laboratories. What they sell their customers is they would come in and set up an entire clinical laboratory for a customer. They would build and configure the machinery that you see like in this picture here, and then they would make sure the whole thing works. Now these are typically laboratories that analyze blood samples, and they can process thousands of tubes of samples in a given day. And all of this stuff is done automatically. The samples all have barcodes on them. They move from machine to machine like an assembly line. Some of these machine lines can be 100 meters long. They can have literally dozens of analyzer machines in them. And it's normal for each machine in the line to be doing some kind of a measurement on that blood sample. So that's what this is. Brian, my co-author, tells me that when he was working as an analytical chemist in laboratories years ago, they would do these things manually, and having a laboratory with all this automation was like their dream. Someday it'll be this way. Well, it is now. But you can imagine if you did all this manually, how slow it would be, how labor intensive, how many opportunities for mistakes. So it's fully automated. I just want to show you this process from the standpoint of a physician and a patient. In this diagram, if you look at the lower left, it's showing a prescription getting written by the physician. you keep going a little further clockwise, the sample gets collected and validated and then shipped to the laboratory. Looking over at the right-hand side of the circle, the sample gets checked in, it goes through several steps with all these machines that were shown in the picture, and the outcome of it is a report that goes back to the physician. So this is just another way to look at the process. The other thing I should mention here is every installation is unique. They don't just design one laboratory and then build 20 of them or 50. Everyone is different. Every customer, has a different desire for what they want. Okay, moving right along. So let's talk about what the problem was. And this is talking about what is the problem as they saw it. Let's see, I think I've got them. Let me see if I can X out this warning that's showing up on the screen. Good. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, coming back to the problem as they see it. They saw their clinical automation world changing pretty rapidly. Among the changes, they had to do with cybersecurity, requiring more upgrades to the machines. They had a new external sales force that was, not making things faster. Customer requirements changing much more rapidly than they were used to. There were new regulatory initiatives expected to come from the EU, and they were wondering how they're going to cope with that. Now, up till now, their stage gate type of process for both software and hardware had been adequate. It was good. But this was really putting strain on it, these factors. And a lot of these aren't unique to them, right? You can see that. So what the worry was that they might lose their market dominant position if they didn't make some sort of serious change and do it pretty quickly. So next we're going to talk about what they did. And I can say that a couple of middle managers really took some strong interest in Agile, and they started wondering what they might do about it. One was the head of software development, and the other was the head of quality assurance. And they promoted these ideas among the other managers at their level. Okay, so next thing what they did is they said, hey, let's convert to Agile. Let's just do it. Let's talk it up and make it happen. Well, they tried to, and it failed. They were trying too many changes everywhere all at once, and it wasn't really working. When they had to pull back and admit that, people kind of had a little huddle, and they said, well, there's nothing for us to go back to. And there were some bright spots in what we were doing with the Agile practices. We just have to focus it differently and go one step at a time. So the other things I have highlighted on this slide are the actions that they credit most heavily with their later success, which I'm going to describe. First of all, they decided to study, to really have a look at what happened. Okay, study the experience of other companies, especially that were dealing in software and hardware. Okay, and then they said to their teams, we want you to be more involved. We want you to help envision a different way for us to work and to stay out of the old silos that we had in the company. Cross-functional teams were another big factor for them. They thought that they figured out that having a software developer plus a tester plus a QA person on each small team was going to be necessary. So they did that. They learned quickly that they really had to be ready to test what they create and not just toss it over the wall, the old style testing. They were supported throughout by QA. In the past, QA tended to get involved just toward the end of development, like we've all seen. Okay, and lastly, they chose their tools. They didn't have to conform to someone else's definition of what tools to use. They didn't come along and say, let's buy this tool, it'll make us agile. They didn't have that mindset. After having envisioned how they wanted to work, they looked for tools that would help them do that. Jira and Jenkins were a couple of the ones they chose. And let's continue on. Let's look at what they did. Oh, a little more about what they did. This is just a circumstance they happened to be there. The company had some simulation software that they used when they were dealing with a new customer, right? It's not unlike if you were getting your kitchen remodeled, the contractor might show you a little virtual reality walkthrough of what the new thing would look like. Well, they had commissioned previously some software to do that, and that's what the company used when they would initially talk to a customer about what sort of a layout they wanted in their lab. Okay, so this is just a diagram of a little bit of information of what the system would do. The managers there said, hey, let's start taking that and let's build on that as we're figuring out what we need, a new installation to do. One of the things they also did, which was common to me in my own previous experience, is they separated their software from their hardware. So for each one of those analytical machines you saw in the picture, that has software on it and it's got hardware. Well, one of the core things we do in embedded systems, and now all Agile teams doing embedded systems work do this, but I was one of the early people figuring it out, and there were others too. We just didn't know each other at the time. But what we did was we found new ways to cut the software entirely away from the hardware so that we could totally control its inputs. That meant we could exercise the software even for tricky, weird malfunctions, okay? And things that really shouldn't happen, but you knew they could. They would just be murdered to reproduce if they ever happened, right? So that allowed us to really speed up our development. In fact, that's the reason why in that commercial product I mentioned earlier, we actually came in per the original schedule. This was late 90s that we did this. The only time I ever saw a project come in on schedule before Agile was in wide use. Anyhow, since they were able to do that, they could take the software just from their whole set of machines they were going to put in an installation. They could tie it up with that simulator, and then they could get a simulation of what sort of throughput they would be getting for that laboratory, for how many blood samples they could measure reliably. So here's a diagram that's a little bit big and scary, but this shows you what they had running. If you imagine a laboratory with 3 machines in the setup, the one over at the right where it says System Simulator, that's the one, that's the existing simulator software. They could run that together with the software from 3 machines in a standalone mode with no hardware, and then they could look at they could rerun the code build and the functional tests, for just during development. And then they could validate that. The validation group is shown there over at the right. And then you could put all that together and simulate the throughput for the system. So another really great benefit of this is that it really put the communications on steroids for the company. Upper management loved it because it was a way for them to talk to the technical people. It was a great way to talk to customers too, as it had always been when it was only a simulator. But now it was so much more than that, and it was great for different technical groups to talk to one another. Now, I think that they would have ended up with this kind of a layout, even if the simulator hadn't existed, even if it wasn't in the picture, because they were on the track for it. They were reading about these techniques. But I think it was a real stroke of genius that they did take over that simulator, because it made a bridge for them. It let them shortcut right into this high productivity way of operating. So, to wrap up on this one, some results here. The Jenkins pipeline that you just saw diagrammed, they had bi-weekly continuous integration activities going on. They were at 50% coverage with their test framework at the time we talked with them. This was 2 years ago when the book came out. Their simulation system could simulate up to 30,000 tubes a day. 30,000 samples could be processed, in this kind of arrangement. And their delivery cycles were really fast as well. For a given machine, a new patch could be in place in a month, and a whole installation with a new customer could be brought up in about 3 months delivery cycle. So, I'm gonna pause for a second and see if there's any questions. Gary,
Hi Nancy, this is great so far. Are
do you need a
those,
mic?
do I need a mic?
No.
Okay, we have a mic runner.
Thank you, appreciate that. Nancy, great presentation so far. I just had a question. Are these tests done as soon as we check in, or because I noticed that there was multiple applications in that environment, did you have to schedule when these tests would run? Or was it as soon as you committed code with the CI, it would automatically kick off?
I couldn't truthfully answer that since I wasn't involved, but I imagine it was probably a mix.
Okay.
That's my best guess.
Excellent. And what type of, and second question, what type of maybe maintenance would be needed for a system like this? Did you have to have a dedicated Scrum team that just refreshed test data? Did you have some sort of, where they would have had, guessing, would they have had to pull data automatically to refresh it? How would you have to maintain it?
I don't really know those details. It seems reasonable that they might, but I don't know about it in that much depth, because I wasn't part of making it happen. But anyway, thanks for a stab at a good question. I'm going to move along to the next one. We got a question online? Go ahead.
David online is questioning how 50% test coverage could be sufficient. How do you think in your automation testing 50%?
I will say from my own experience that when we were at that kind of a level, it was good for the embedded systems I've worked on, partly because we were very judicious about where and how we implemented our first tests. We tried to do them in places that were critical to the functioning of most of the system. So I'm guessing that they were onto a similar type of logic as that. Okay, that's the best I can tell you, because this is what we know from talking with them. I'm going to move on to the next one, and this one, I love busting myths a little bit. A lot of people are of the belief that long-range planning and Agile just don't go together, but I don't think that's true. And this case study comes from Sanofi, and they're a huge company, so we're talking about one group within Sanofi. This group is locally here in Cambridge, Mass, and they're working on a product for diabetic patients. Okay? And I'm sure these things are much more common now. A few years ago, they were, a lot of these kind of things were in development, but I see ads all the time now for products like this, where it's a little ecosystem of things. One part of it is some sort of wearable monitor. People might wear it on their arm or somewhere else, and it monitors their blood glucose level. Another portion of it is an app on their phone that communicates with the wearable. Another part is the application that a physician will be using in their office. And there's often some sort of a web portal and maybe a server with various databases. So it's something of a little ecosystem, all right? And so that's kind of just a description of the product we're talking about in the group. And the other thing I should mention is SAMD is an acronym on here. It means software as a medical device. And that's because until, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, pretty much any software involved in a medical device was buried inside of a physical instrument or a machine. And as it started to be different, as it started to be in the form like this, an ecosystem, the regulators realized they needed to somehow address that. So there is regulation governing software as a medical device, and there are standards for how to develop that. So just a little aside to explain that. So the other thing I wanted to say about this team is they have already been using Agile practices. They weren't in the middle of trying to institute it. So let's look at what was the problem. What did they see the problem? And for them, this is going to read very similar to the last case study. They were needing to produce faster than before. Okay. Another issue was the stakeholders had much longer term expectations. And by that I mean the stakeholders felt the need to do quite a lot of blue sky thinking. They might be asking questions like, could we monitor other things with the same wearable? If we did that, how would that play out for both the patient and the physician and for the other components in the ecosystem? So this is kind of big blue sky thinking, and it might introduce new risks or new questions that would have to be investigated. Next item, there was some pressure to get going and, get down to brass tacks and start making product. So these last two things kind of fight each other, don't they? And the last thing I want to say on this in terms of issues, all medical device companies deal with this in some form or other. You can lose a lot of money very fast if you start down the validation path before you've really made up your mind about what your product is. If you keep changing the design and then revalidating, that can get to be very expensive. And that same problem doesn't exist in other kinds of development. So if you're a medical device company, if you can somehow get very sure, very early, of what you want to build, and then just go through and build it and get it validated, that's going to be your least costly path. Okay? All right, let's continue. So the way we wanted to cope with this was to have another little stage onto the pipeline before they tried to narrow down their requirements into proper Agile user stories. They had sort of a 6 to 12 month period where they would ask themselves, what other things do we need to define or de-risk or think harder about before we start rushing to hammer out stories and get busy producing them? Make sense? Okay, so we're in October right now. If we were doing that kind of planning, we would have, say, between now and April, June time period to ask ourselves, okay, for the features we want to be building next spring, do we need to get medical expert opinions? Do we need to do any research studies? Do we need, what might be the potential risks? What might be the questions regulators will be asking us? So they set aside essentially an explicit period to deal with this kind of thing. And then once they would get into the point where they're putting it into proper Agile stories, that's where they would estimate them using story points, and they would, their product owner would be doing the task of planning out the release schedule. Because that would be what the product owner really wanted to focus on. What can we release when? And we want to make sure we're releasing things that have been well vetted in the sense of not investing too heavily in validation when we aren't sure yet what we should be producing. See what I'm saying? They're trying to walk that edge. Okay, so that's the process. Now this all sounds awfully abstract, so I wanted to give an example of a particular feature that really needed this kind of a development path, where you have that look-ahead period before you try to narrow things down. So here's a description of the next, of a feature that really needed this kind of planning. Their current product, which was already out in the field, that's the ecosystem I described for patients, that was meant for diabetic patients who were in a maintenance stage, which means they were at steady state with their blood chemistry, and they were just maintaining, and that's what they were using the device for. They had a new feature called basal titration that they wanted to add, but that feature is not really meant for people that are just maintaining. The feature is meant for people who need to get to a level that they're not at now. And part of what the feature does is it computes what new level you need to be at, and it instructs the patient on, when to do their next dosing and what amounts. Make sense? So you might say, okay, I don't see a problem here. I might say that because I'm not a doctor. But as they discussed it, they realized that, wait a second, there could be issues with this because these two use cases are very different. The basic titration is really a stepping stone to become on a maintenance level. And so that raised some questions about how best to instruct the patient and how to work the user interface. So what did they do? They did some internal reviews. This is what companies do when they're, not sure the direction to take. They did discuss with their medical experts. They discussed with their usability people. And what was coming out of these discussions, remember, this is part of what that look-ahead period is for. You can go off and have these discussions, right? You don't have to hammer out user stories right now and be ready in a week. So they went and had these discussions. They were starting to settle on two possible designs that both looked promising. And now at this point, if they were a non-Agile company, it would have been common to just have some sort of high-level discussions and pick one. And the danger in doing that might be that some months down the road, you discover it's not really working so well, patients are having difficulty with it, or there's maybe some other issue, okay? Now, so what do they do? Instead, they said, okay, let's get some data, right? As Agilists, we always rather have data than just hunches. So they said, we'll construct 2 prototypes, according to each design. Let's pick 10 patients and 10 doctors right here in Boston and run a formative study. So that's what they did. And, okay, drum roll please. Once they ran the study, now I'm not sure how long the study took. This might have been a few weeks, it might have been a couple of months. But again, this is the kind of thing that you need some variable space for, like in that look-ahead period. Okay, so they ran a study, and that gave them the confidence to choose one of the designs. Now, the study could just as easily have said, hey, wait a minute, there's real problems with both of these. Whoops, and then it would be back to the drawing board. Again, that's why you need that buffer time. Okay, so this helped them to avoid that common mistake that I already described. So the good thing about this kind of road mapping is it really allowed them to be explicit about a process that's outside their control, but is critical and necessary to coming up with a good product. Whether it's a study or consulting with a medical expert somewhere else, or you see what I'm getting at, or using some outside consultants for their specialties. You have to acknowledge that anything can come out of it when you're doing research. And you have to be able to say, all right, we're ready to abandon this path then, if we just can't find something workable. Or we're ready to move it further out into the release cycle, if that's what we need to do. So that's pretty much it. The other nice thing is that it gives them clear data. They ran the study with the 2 different designs. So if later auditors were to ask them, well, what made you pick this design? Why wasn't the other one used? They could say, well, here's why we know. We ran this study. And it's a better thing to say that than to just say, well, we had a bunch of discussions and this is our hunch. Sometimes the hunch is all you have to go on, though. But if you can get data, that's better. Okay, so this is the end of this case study for this part of the talk. I just want to pause a minute in case there's a question someone wants to bring up. Okay, Maggie.
This question's from Jerry Weldon. How were any stage gates approval processes like regulatory compliance, security compliance, architectural approvals, and et cetera, that previously caused delay addressed?
Well, I believe they would do those at the, as part of scheduling their releases, because packaging up the releases is what the product owner is doing, and they would have some discussions. Also, one of the things in the diagram there that I had a couple slides ago was a little marker a few months, about 6 months before release, a little marker to say, do they need to have pre-clearance discussions with the regulators? So that's one place to get like an early heads up from the regulators if there might be an issue, you know, if the regulators or the company had questions or could see an issue coming up. So that's one way to look ahead and avoid trouble if you can. And other than that, they would do whatever their quality management system called for in terms of getting anything audited or checked. So wait for the mic. Can we bring the mic over here?
So my question for you is, right, since it's just a software and it's invasive glucose monitoring, so at what stage did you get the cybersecurity people involved, because they are as critical to the regulatory compliance? Because in your previous diagrams, I have seen a lot of teams, but like I didn't see anything on the cybersecurity side of it. Sorry.
I just didn't highlight something about cybersecurity in this particular case study, but I have no doubt that it was involved somewhere. I'm trying to be brief on these for the sake of time today.
Sure.
But there wasn't a special issue in that, you know, that got in the way of using this type of forecasting.
Got it.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to move along to the next one. And this company is called Bluefruit Software. They're based in Cornwall in the UK. And they consist of embedded software specialists. They have over 70 employees currently. It says here they're born agile. That's because the company founder was a software developer. And he was interested in agile practices pretty much from day one. And he really wanted to have a situation where it was a positive environment for developers to work in. So really it was high quality that drove the growth of this company. They contract out software development services to other companies. They tend to bring the work in-house rather than send individual people out to their customers. They, let me think, what else am I going to say? It's been high quality work because of the agile practices. Okay, they really took the embedded systems techniques of separating the software from the hardware and the test first ideas, and they've really focused on them. They've let me think. They don't do waterfall development even if the client wants them to. They're polite about it, but they will refer the client to another supplier that's willing to work that way. Because some clients just don't know what to do with completed software and a test suite being handed to them. But that doesn't happen very often anymore. They have lower employee turnover than the industry in general. I think they have around 4%, and the industry is something like 11, 12%. So that's a description of what they do. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit, so you might ask, geez, what problem do they have, right? So you can't have problems, you've got life going for you, right? Well, no such luck. Okay, so what did they see as an issue? Any company as it grows is going to develop more layers and more different functions. And they're just focused on, the different kinds of work that they need to do. And Paul Massey, who's the founder of the company, he was worried about these things getting in the way of empowerment for the developers. He wanted developers to understand exactly why everything had to be done the way it needed to be done. And he wanted them to fully buy into it. So when we asked him, tell us more about what this empowerment idea means to you, really. And he said, well, as a manager, he said, I need to avoid creating situations where management has to overrule the teams to safeguard another thing that's also important to the company. And now, growth was important to the company, but they weren't going to give that up. You know, there's a lot of things that are important to the company that maybe developers don't understand all the intricacies, and maybe they feel like shortcutting some stuff, or they don't want to support it. So the idea isn't to give up those benefits, you know, just because the developers aren't interested. But he really sees it as important to somehow have the buy-in happening. Okay. I'll move along here a little bit. I want to give you an example about a question that came along where Paul had a problem on this empowerment issue. But I have to take a little side path for a moment to explain to you something about certifications. In this scenario, regulatory certifications, really all they are is a set of rules by which to audit a company. So if you say that you have a quality management system that's in compliance with the regulations, well, there's a document that says, you know, the definition of what that means, and there's auditors in the world who will come to your company for a fee and examine what you're doing and tell you if you're in compliance with that regulation. So this slide shows several regulations that exist. For example, this one over towards the right there says Part 11. That's about electronic records and signatures. You see the one at the far left. That's about your software development lifecycle. Yes, there is regulations about what should be in a software development lifecycle. But anyway, we're not going to talk about those. The question that was in front of management of the company was this one. Hey, we'd like to get some business in the medical device world. We've already done a lot of automotive and a lot of industrial and so forth, but we haven't had clients from medical devices just yet. And we know they value quality, and we're really good at quality, so why are we not getting them? And somebody said, well, maybe we should get certifications, regulatory certifications, as a way to attract the business. So they asked business advisors that they have, because, you know, they're a real corporation, and they have people who advise them as a business. And they said, hey, what would be involved in us getting a certification? And these people said to them, well, you can hire somebody to come in and evaluate you against whichever standard you're interested in. And let's say you need a quality management system. Someone could come, audit you, and say, well, if you change A, B, and C, then you'll be in compliance with the regs. And I'll even write you a quality manual that your employees have to follow. Okay, so you can get all that done. And in a few months' time, you can get yourself all certified. So Paul thought about this, and this was one of the things on his mind, but there was also another thing he was interested in as well. He was also curious about employee ownership, because another advisor said, hey, you should think about employee ownership. That way people would have to buy into all kinds of things, because they're in charge of their own destiny. Okay, so Paul being Paul, he decided he didn't like the idea of an outside consultant authoring a quality management system for them, as a for instance, because he says that would break empowerment. You know, this kind of thing should be coming from the developers. Okay, and his feeling was, if it's externally created, they're going to question it, and they might have some good objections, but he didn't want to have that battle. He didn't feel that there would be genuine buy-in. Okay, so now I have on the title of this slide what they did, but this next bullet isn't something they did. It's just a happenstance. Life being what it is, one day a company came knocking on their door, and it was a medical device company, and said, hey, would you be interested in writing software for us? So this was at a point where Bluefruit wasn't really in the business yet. They hadn't really done all their homework, or, well, you know what I mean. They hadn't got any certifications. So the company that came asking, I'm going to tell you a little backstory about them. The story with them is they were somewhat new to medical devices, but they were experienced hardware people, and maybe some experience with software, I'm not that sure. But they had built a medical device, and they wanted to get it passed by the regulators. They had gone to their own business advisors, who told them, forget it, you are out to lunch. You didn't do the software under a validated quality management system. So, sorry guys, out. And they had trouble believing this, but they talked to all kinds of people they trusted, and they got told to know in certain terms, the thing for you to do is this. You will be able to get your hardware validated. It's pretty good and solid. Your software is never going to get through, so you should toss it, and you should hire somebody to develop the software for you over again under a qualified management system. Well, that's a hard pill for them, but they said, okay, let's go looking, because they still needed to get on with life, and they trusted the people giving them the advice. So they came to Bluefruit, ironically, because of Bluefruit's quality, not because Bluefruit had any certifications. They just had the real thing, quality. And let's talk a little bit about specifically what impressed them about the company. They were impressed by the use of behavior-driven development and test-driven development. They were impressed by pair programming, and I'll also add Bluefruit does monk programming too. Okay, that's my thing. Bluefruit also has a blind hiring process that hires totally based on merit and nothing else. In the book, we go into some detail about that, but I don't have time for it here. And all of these things really served to convince this company that they could engage Bluefruit to redevelop their software, and that it would get through the regulatory scrutiny. And if you can imagine, I mean, if I were them, I would be kind of upset, because I've already paid for software once, now I'm getting ready to pay for it a second time, and if I don't pick the right company, I might have to pay for it a third time. So that would be pretty upsetting, I should think. I should also add, as an aside, the law didn't require Bluefruit to have certifications. They can still build product for a manufacturer of medical devices. It's the actual manufacturer of record who's required to have the certifications, right? This is so that you can't just pass the buck to your supplier, you know, say, oh, we're fine, our supplier made that mistake. Okay, so then if you think it through, you realize it's a sensible reg. So they're not required to. The company that hires them to build stuff is required to have the certifications. So anyway, moving right along. So all of a sudden, the Bluefruit folks felt a little hesitant, because as part of their sales process, as they start getting into things, there's a disclosure period where they get to look at the existing software. They get to look at, you know, well, what have you done so far? Let's go into the covers. So when they looked at the software, well, here's what happened. Paul said, it kind of drew our team in, so rather than feel anxious about that kind of responsibility, about making sure people couldn't come to harm if we got this stuff wrong, it was more like, if we don't help these folks out, people are going to come to harm, because the software was pretty bad. And as the team looked at it, they could see that their own coding practices were way more solid. And so what ended up happening is, instead of feeling hesitant about taking on this job, they felt like, you know, extra confident, really. And so this was a big morale boost for the team, ultimately. And they went ahead and did this project. And they, you know, it all worked out. It got them into the medical device field. By the way, they're still in it now. They're not exclusive. They do whatever kind of embedded systems work they can pick up. But they've been doing more and more medical device work. Here is a couple years since we did the book. They still don't have any certifications. They just don't need it. Their clients don't care, because their clients have the certifications. You see, all they need is the software that will really pass muster. So I want to show you a little something that Paul had to say. Being a software developer who started the company, he's championed various things along the way, like convincing the developers of the merits of a regulation like Part 11, which is the electronic signatures and records stuff, or behavior-driven development, or TDD. You know, he would go in and champion these things and get his teams all wrapped up. And, you know, as he put it, I've always said to myself, if the team doesn't buy in, then we're just not doing it. And he's totally dedicated on that. And I think this last statement is a big one. The onus is on me to get that buy-in. And I've talked to a lot of, you know, leaders and execs in companies where I've coached. And a lot of times they talk about alignment. It's an abstract idea, but so is empowerment. You know, they're talking about alignment here and there in the company and all these different functions. I really think they're talking about the same thing. When they say alignment, they're thinking of it from like the CEO level. And when Paul says empowerment, he's thinking of it from, from the hands-on level, right? And anyway, I just think it's food for thought for anybody in exec levels in companies. So let's move on and talk about how these things all cooked out here. So they did get into medical devices, but what about employee ownership? They did take a bunch of steps towards employee ownerships very thoughtfully. The book goes into it in quite a bit of detail, but I don't have time for that today. Essentially, they ended up doing it. The employees agreed, yes, we want to go there. They did several stages to get the employees to understand it and to work out the scenarios. One of the things the advisors told them when management asked, hey, if we go this employee ownership route, how long will it be before things have all settled out and we're back to a normal, you know, working situation day to day? And they were told things like, 2 to 5 years, stuff like this takes a while because it's really a culture change for a company too. And so when they had signed all the papers and they were doing it, they were a few months in, it felt to them like they were already there. They said, it seems like it went faster to us. Does that make sense to you? And the people they consulted with said, oh yeah, well that's true. It's quick for you because your culture is already a culture of accountability and initiative and stepping up and helping each other. Other companies have to learn all that, you know, in order to really be employee-owned and employee-guided. Not that every employee-owned company has Agile values and everything. They can be very, very different. So that's not my message, but this one chose to be that way. Anyhow, it was just interesting that their own path to being employee-owned was much shorter than the path for typical companies. And the other thing, this is my favorite part of the story, even though they did a lot of thinking on this whole move to employee ownership, they completely overlooked 2 benefits that just popped out of nowhere. The first benefit was they were getting more business. And why was that? Well, being employee-owned presents a barrier to selling the company. And the reason is, this is in the UK, they had a new law come out around the time that, you know, they did all this. And the law gave the company and the employees some pretty substantial tax benefits if the company went employee-owned. If the company were to be bought back into private hands, you know, at some later time, a lot of those benefits would have to be paid back to the government. And if you think about it, you realize that's a smart regulation, because otherwise people would just be switching the companies back and forth. Okay, so that shook out to meaning more business. Because let's say I'm a little company, you know, down the road from Bluefruit, and I want them to develop software for me because I don't have any developers in-house. I just got my hardware guys. And I got a big company in the next town over who's my competitor. I don't want to do business with Bluefruit because the big company also does, and they might buy Bluefruit, and then I'm going to be hosed. See? But now, if there's a barrier to them being sold, I feel more free to give them my business. So that was the way it works. The second one is also related to sale of a company. If you have outside shareholders, that's another layer of people that want to have a cut. So without that, you're free to either have lower prices or pay your people more or whatever. In any case, you're just more competitive. So that's the end of this one. I'll pause in case there's a question. Hey, do you need a mic? Yeah, get a mic so that way everybody can hear you.
So what does it actually mean to be employee owned? Were they getting stock? Did they actually have to pony up some cash to have an ownership that come out of salaries? Never heard of that before, so I'm interested in that.
Okay, well, the book goes into it in some more detail, but to just put it in a nutshell, no, the employees didn't have to pony up any money at all. It meant that they would become part owners. They, in the way you have choices about how you organize the business. So they chose a way that still has a board of directors that's actually in charge. And that board of directors has, I think, 3 or 4 people plus 2 employee representatives on it. So if all the employees are feeling unhappy about something, they have to go to those 2 representatives and get them to speak up. So that's part of the governance. There's a way of sharing out the profits. This is something that you get to choose when you become employee-owned, at least, under this UK law. In sharing out the profits, you could, and it's common, to share them out based on how much salary you already get. So if I get twice as much as you get, I would get twice the profit share that you get. But Blueford chose to share out the profits equally among everybody, regardless of what pay level or position you're at. Does that answer your question, William?
Interesting too.
Okay.
That would be equal, because that means everyone feels like they got an equal stake regardless of how much they normally make.
Yep. Okay, any other question? Okay, if not, I'm going to move right along. I'm almost done. And we're going to sum up. But before I put my words out here, I wonder what you notice after hearing about these 3 different case studies. You notice anything in common that they have? Or something you didn't think of? Just curious.
Well, it seems like the last company really focuses on self-organization and the team concept, empowerment. I learned that difference between empowerment and alignment. So it seems like the third case study really focused on a self-organizing team.
Okay, you said the third case study seemed to really focus on self-organizing team. Anybody else? Comment? Question? Oh, in the back. Do you want to grab a mic so we can hear you? Yeah, grab the mic. Yeah. Somebody's got to bring one over to you.
There you go. Difficult to sell the business. I don't know. Maybe in medical devices it's a plus, but not able to sell the company in this world of mergers and acquisitions seems to be a negative to me.
Well, yes, you're asking about, it seems like a disadvantage that they wouldn't be able to sell the company. Well, the employees as individuals, they're not like stockholders in a public company where they could just sell their share and go on. That's true. But the idea of a barrier to sale, it's really that you have to pay back those benefits that you were handed by the government. So the public actually gave you that money. It's not an impossible barrier. I mean, you could sell the company. You would just have to, the government would say, well, we're not getting our benefit anymore that we kicked in for. So I think if you stack it up against other options, all things considered, I don't know that it's that much worse than anything else. But anyway, it's something to think about. There's not really a cut and dry answer for it. I wondered that a little bit myself, but I could see that if there wasn't that barrier to sale, somebody could just keep selling the company and buying it back and keep on getting tax breaks over and over. so that also wouldn't work out. Okay. Any more? Well, let me show you what I was thinking. I put this in. My feeling is that, you do need to understand the principles, but it's not enough. You've got to understand the context that you're dealing with, if you're trying to institute real agile change in a company. You might have to, you do have to choose and maybe create the practices and also add tools that are going to help you do it. But more than anything else, in each of these case studies we looked at, people found their own way. They decided to take ownership of their path, of finding a way to be more agile. So, with the Empirico, the communications that were enabled by using that simulator really helped bring everything around. With Sanofi, using planning that can accommodate hard to predict things, processes that are outside your control, that helped them to see ahead down the road. And with Bluefruit, the self-organization and the empowerment principle comes through really strong. So that's how I see it, almost at the end. If you're interested in the book, and we're going to give one away, right? Is that why Amy's getting ready to come up here? Okay. If you're interested in the book, I'm giving away a copy. And this last slide here has some contact information to reach me. But I'll come back over to this one for now. Come on up, Amy. Okay. It's your turn at the mic next anyway. And I'm supposed to pick up.
Did anyone not get a raffle ticket who wanted to get one before we do the raffle? All right.
Okay, you want me to pick?
I do, yeah.
Okay, she does.
Ready?
I'm not going to read the ticket. I won't know whose ticket it is.
Get out your tickets, see who won.
All right, I'm seeing 5494776. Has anybody got 4776? Yay! There's the lucky ticket.
Winner, winner.
And here you go. You need this?
Oh, yeah, sure. All right, thank you so much, Nancy, for that. Also, good for you. I hope she signed it.